Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Cambridge Getting to Net Zero Energy Panel. I'm Henrietta Davis. I'm the mayor, and I have the pleasure of being able to welcome this wonderful panel to us this evening. I especially want to thank our moderator, Henry Lee, from whom I audited a class at the Kennedy School of Government a few years ago that opened my eyes to the many aspects of energy efficiency, renewable energy, what's the grid, what are all these things that make a difference in getting to net zero or even just powering up. So my own personal involvement with this started when I went to a Department of Energy panel in Washington and found out about a school in Kentucky where they were going net zero in the school. And it was a delightful story of this school told by the school children themselves. And I thought, we could do that. We could at least try. And we have a school that we're building. We should try to do this too. Then came the Connolly petition, Mike Connolly's here, challenging the city to look at all its new buildings as net zero. And the state is working on net zero issues. And soon I'm going to Fort Collins, Colorado, where they're trying to manage all their energy in the city with Colorado State University as net zero. So these words mean many different things. Net zero, you go to here, and I think you have a crib sheet here that says net zero has many different definitions. I think tonight we're going to hear from the panel about how to think about net zero and what the potential is here. So I want to welcome my fellow elected officials, and I know I saw Patty Nolan. Could you please raise your hands and help me out? And David Marr, City Councilor. Any others, I'm not sure, but welcome to you all. I want to welcome the City Manager, Rich Rossity, and the Deputy, Lisa Peterson, who I think is there also. Hi, Lisa. And I want to thank, again, Henry Lee for being our moderator this evening. Henry is the Jassim M. I can't even say that. Jada, Family Director of the Environment and Natural Resources Program within the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Faculty co-chair of both the school's International Infrastructure Program and the Energy Technology Innovation Policy Program project, and a senior lecturer in public policy, where he teaches energy policy, technology, systems, and markets, and management, finance, and regulation of public infrastructure in developing countries. Henry, I want to thank you very much for moderating this evening and for sharing your knowledge on this subject. Please come forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor Davis, and especially because you're my favorite auditor I've ever had. So your enthusiasm was very impressive, and I was very honored to have you in the class. About a week ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its latest report. Every 5 years, as you know, the panel releases it. And it once again made us very aware that we are facing a major crisis, a crisis to the entire planet. But it's a crisis that is only really going to get resolved not in international meetings, because we've been doing those for 14 years and haven't had a lot of success. And I'm not so sure, given what's going on in Washington these days, it's going to be resolved there either. But it's going to get resolved, I think, at the local level and at the state level. And the city of Cambridge has continually been in advance in these areas. And I think that the whole area and the whole issue and the debate that is now going on here on getting to net zero, I think is very encouraging. But it is also an issue that is complex. It is an issue that has people on both sides of it. And therefore tonight we have a panel of experts who understand this issue both from a technical perspective and an economic perspective. And hopefully that this discussion in the next hour will enlighten all of us, including me, as to the strengths and the challenges around getting to net zero. I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to ask them a few questions, and eventually I'm going to open this up to your questions. I want to try to do that a little earlier than we had originally anticipated, because given the audience and given the people in it, I know you have a lot of particular questions, and I want to give you the opportunity to ask them. So let me introduce the panel, and I'm going to introduce them from left to right, or my left to my right. Jane Carboni is the Senior Project Manager for Homeowners Rehab, Inc., a non-profitable, not profitable. Well, a lot of things that are non-profitable. It's a non-profit affordable housing developer in Cambridge, and she oversees the development of affordable rental and home ownership opportunities. Rob Deemer is an architectural engineer. He's LEEDs accredited and the founding partner of the Posse LLC, which provides consulting and engineering design services for high-performance, deep green projects with a special expertise in net zero energy. Eric Friedman is the Deputy Director of the Green Communities Division at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. His experience includes 10 years in the Leading by Example program in clean energy projects. Stephen Turner is the president of Stephen Turner, Inc. He is an expert on retrofits and is a commissioning expert with 35 years experience in engineering, construction, commissioning, operation, and maintenance of buildings and building systems. And finally, Janice Silsby is also LEEDs accredited, is an associate principal at Perkins Eastman with more than 20 years experience on a diverse portfolio of academic, residential, and healthcare projects. As you can see, I think the total background experience on the panel is probably close to 90 years. So we're not going to learn from this panel, I don't think we'll learn from any panel. But I think it's important that we start by trying to define a few terms. So I've asked Rob if he could define net energy zero.
Sure, Henry. Very simply, net zero or net energy is harvesting as much energy from renewable sources as you use from non-renewable sources in a year. So the two net out to zero. You harvest renewable energy from photovoltaics or wind or wherever, hydroelectric, and then you take energy from the grid, but the two equal zero. Hopefully, you harvest more renewable than you use from the grid, and you're a little net zero positive. So that's net zero energy.
Does this mean that every building must generate its own energy?
Not necessarily, but for the most part, net zero energy has been thought of at the building level. But that's changing, as the mayor pointed out, in Fort Collins, where they're starting to think of it at a district or a community level. So it doesn't have to be isolated to the building. But to date, most net zero projects have been at the building level or the immediate site around the building.
Okay. And Jane, can you tell us a little bit about why this issue and why this idea has emerged here in Cambridge?
Well, I can speak. Can you hear me? I can speak to why it became an important issue at homeowners rehab. And as you described, we're a Cambridge nonprofit agency. We've been around for almost 30 years, and we have a significant portfolio. We own about 1,200 units of housing. We do retrofits of existing structures, and we do new construction. So recently, in the past, actually, we have made a goal of trying to retrofit and reduce energy consumption in our developments for our residents, but also to contribute to the city's goal of reducing carbon emissions. So there are a few projects, and I put a handout out there for folks to look at, and I just want to briefly talk about there are 3 developments that I have worked on since 2009, and I just wanted to talk about quickly what our goal was to try to achieve net zero and some of the challenges that we faced. So in the past, we have always looked at energy efficiency improvements improvements for our buildings, but in 2009, we had an incident where there was a building, there was a fire, and the building was heavily damaged on the inside, and so we thought no one was hurt, but we thought this was an opportunity to go beyond some of the energy conservation measures that we were doing and try to see if we could achieve net zero energy. So the building was gutted, and we hired a contractor, and we worked with a couple of engineers that were, had the same goals and mission as we did. So we super insulated the building. We were working with the state to get some energy, renewable technologies in there, and we got a grant to install solar PV. So we maximized the roof area for PV, and then we also we funded the solar domestic system. So the building envelope was super tight, and we had as much renewables as we could install on the building footprint. And then the building was an interesting, on a corner lot. So, and we didn't want to decrease the square footage in the unit for the residents. So we blew in insulation on the interior, but then we added insulation to the exterior before we put the clapboards on, and worked with the Historic Commission for review and approval. So, and our goal has always been to, be energy conscious. So in the end, and then we set up a tracking system. So we have software through a company called New Ecology that can help us track the energy usage of that building. So in the graph, you could see that there's a description of the usage of that building before the fire and then after the fire. And with all the energy conservation improvements, we're able to reduce the energy by 69%. So, but we didn't get there. And it was kind of disappointing because I really didn't want to admit it that we didn't quite get there, even though we did as much as we possibly could on the roof with the renewables and on the building envelope. And part of it, I think the challenge is that we're not able to access through the utilities what the usage is of the residents. We can't monitor their usage. They have this, even though we worked to sign waivers with residents, their usage, we couldn't reduce that. Even though and a lot of them wanted to participate and show how they could reduce their energy consumption, we never got to zero. In the summertime, we were able to reduce because the solar was running, but we were not able to reduce completely the energy efficiency of that building. And then more recently, in 2012, we completed a new construction development on Putnam Square, where, again, there's two different building types, and I wanted to see how can we do new construction, and we had a 32-unit building and then a 6-unit building. So we used this system called structured insulated panels, where you get a thicker wall envelope and you get a higher R rating. So one of the buildings was a 2x6 wall with insulation on the inside of the exterior, and then the other building was even a larger insulated wall to get a higher efficiency value. And then, we exceeded R40 on the roof, and we maximized again solar domestic and solar thermal panels. There, we're getting, I think, our reduction in energy consumption there is a third. So we're using a third less energy per square foot compared to a green building. So we're pretty energy efficient, but we're still not at net zero. And again, part of it is because of we can't maximize, there's nowhere else to put any renewables on the roof. The RECs are not something that's, is an approved source or use of funds for affordable housing by investors or lenders. And the usage by tenants is hard to measure and quantify and even access through the utilities. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing as we're trying to achieve our net zero goals in our housing development.
Shanna, what Jane has said is that this is really hard to do. So why should Cambridge adopt a net energy zero goal?
To be honest, I don't necessarily think that it should be an absolute. I think that the idea of conservation is much more important as a community than energy generation on every single project. I think that some projects will have the opportunity for energy generation, and I think that if you're wanting to encourage that, it should be done through incentives. Like, for instance, if it's part of the zoning law, then maybe if your developer was encouraged to put on, say, photovoltaics, then you got a little bit of extra FAR, or a little bit of extra height, or all those things that are important to the developer. But I think that you can't look at net zero energy in a vacuum and have as the holy grail of sustainability within a community. Sometimes the goal of net zero and things that will get you to net zero are in direct conflict and in direct competition with other sustainable strategies that are equally important to a project. And you have to, every project has to find its priorities and has to understand its goals, and it has to understand the inner workings of the integrated systems within the buildings to find what's most important. Now, on the flip side of that, the idea that they would be trying to encourage and doing everything possible to encourage energy conservation in their buildings, making it easier for people to, insulate and to have better performing buildings, having programs to educate, having programs to educate even on things like maintenance. I think that's amazing and wonderful, and I think that their heart is in the right place. But I think that having net zero as the ultimate and the only goal can cause issues.
Stephen, do you agree with that?
Well, I think that, yes, in short. And the example that I would give to reduce the problem to absurdity is to say, theoretically, it's possible to, if you have a broad expanse of on-site renewable generation space available, it's theoretically possible to build a very inefficient building and take it to net zero. Now, in the real world, that's not practical. But I use that example to show that what Jan said about pursuing efficiency and reducing energy spend is very important. And I think there's a reason that the primary frameworks for pursuing high sustainability, whether it's a LEED Platinum framework or now we have the Living Buildings Challenge, there's a reason that these frameworks are voluntary, because every project is a series of trade-offs. Every project does have its own constraints, and every owner does have its own priorities. That having been said, I think that at the community level there are important groups of distinctions to be made. There are municipally owned properties, there are privately owned properties, there are new buildings, there are existing buildings, and there may be a different approach required to optimize your goal of transition to a net zero community, if that's what your philosophical goal is indeed. There are probably different steps to take in each of these areas. And the very discussion of net zero, I was so pleased that we started tonight in the context of Jane's remarks about a retrofit project, because sometimes the semantics of net zero lead us to focus on new construction. And new construction, if we're making it net zero, all we're doing is not growing our environmental footprint. Our footprint is already here on the ground in the existing building stock, and that is just a tremendous opportunity and where I spend a lot of my professional life focusing. So, and indeed in the existing building context, net zero it can be a stretch goal for many owners.
Eric, I haven't gotten to Rob yet on this question, but so far, what I'm hearing is A, getting to net zero is real hard. B, that if you set it as ultimate goal, it may end up diverting you from other goals that you want. And what I hear from Stephen is that there's a lot of diversity, a lot of heterogeneity out there in terms of buildings and building ownership, and that there are multiple opportunities for a framework for sustainability, and don't just adopt one path because the world's a lot more complicated. So, Shakim, you think that setting a net zero goal is a good thing for Cambridge, and is a good thing possibly for a state goal?
First of all, let me congratulate the City of Cambridge for holding this forum. I think it's an extraordinary example of how far we've come in just an incredibly short time. For those of you who don't know, Governor Patrick, a number of years ago in 2008, asked the state to put together a task force, asked our agency to put together a task force to look at zero net energy buildings and come up with some recommendations around how to actually achieve zero net energy for residential and commercial developments by 2020 and 2030. And as that task force went through its deliberations, we found that there really were no roadmaps, there were no examples. There were a lot of projects that had done deep energy efficiency, but really there were very few commercial projects and even maybe a couple of residential projects that had actually achieved zero net energy. Here we are 5 years later, and there are several dozen larger scale ZNETs across the country. There are cities and towns and states all across the country that are starting to talk about it. There are conferences and meetings that are labeled zero net energy or net zero energy. So I think we've come a long way toward thinking about this in a really a good framework, a good context that's really moving us forward. So now, to answer your question, certainly being from the state, it's not my job to tell municipalities what they should or shouldn't be doing. I would certainly never sort of jump into that debate. But I think I would certainly agree with a lot of the comments that have been presented here today in suggesting that zero net energy is really an aspirational goal right now. It may make sense for certain kinds of buildings in certain kinds of locations with certain kinds of resources. And then for other projects, it just may not make sense. And you may spin your wheels and spend huge amounts of money to get that extra bit of renewable or to get that extra bit of technology that could be better spent on some other aspect of the building that would have much greater environmental or even energy benefit. So I think where we are today is that the movement around zero net energy is growing. It's growing quickly. It's growing among practitioners. It's growing among governments. It's growing among regulators. But we're not at the point, I think, where clear and direct mandates that everything be zero is really achievable at the moment.
I just have to clarify something, is that you say that the movement is growing rapidly around the country, and yet you say it's an aspirational goal at the same time. If it's an aspirational goal, then it's growing in terms of hope rather than reality. Is that right? Or am I being unfair?
Well, I'm not going to answer that. I think it's an aspirational goal that is actually being achieved more and more. And so 5, 6, 7 years ago, it really was an aspirational goal. It was sort of a gleam in the eyes of developers or designers. How do we get there? Lo and behold, when people sat down and we did integrated design, when you had your HVAC and your architects and your designers and all the people, the building users, sit down at the table before you even started doing the design work, people found ways to start being creative and start finding solutions to problems that really hadn't even been thought of, much less addressed in earlier designs. So I think it's a combination. It's aspirational in the sense that it should always be a target out there for us to achieve. But I think it's becoming a more realistic goal, certainly for some buildings in some locations. And I think you're going to see the aspiration and the reality get closer and closer as time moves on.
Rob, you've listened, I'll come back to you in a minute. But Rob, you've listened to this. What's your reaction?
Well, I think the panelists have made a lot of really good points, and I do, as Stephen said, you can make a really inefficient building net zero if you put enough renewable energy systems in place. So, the real issue in my mind is changing our relationship with energy. And net zero is a really interesting goal, and it excites people and fires up their imagination. But at the heart, it's about really learning to live with less intense energy use. And not giving up necessarily, but figuring out different ways of doing it. So if all we do is talk about net zero, you're sort of missing the real importance of it, which is reducing our energy intensity in general. And so what's really, in my mind, most important for Cambridge to focus on as a community is reducing the energy intensity of the buildings in Cambridge, and where appropriate, harvesting renewable energy to offset what remaining energy is being used. I think it's very difficult to get to net zero in the urban environment. It's also very difficult to get to net zero with large buildings on small sites. So we are at the early adoption phase of net zero, much the way we were with green buildings 10 or 15 years ago. And what we've seen to date is the early net zero buildings were relatively small, relatively low energy intensity, not as hard to get to net zero. Now we're taking on the harder, bigger challenges. We're trying things like the MLK school here in Cambridge, the larger office buildings like the research support facility that NREL has done out in Golden, Colorado, the Bullitt Center in Seattle. And we're starting to learn new lessons at this scale. And we're starting to jump to the community scale. All of this is really good, but it's only good to the extent that we're at the same time reducing our overall energy intensity. That really is the key here. And as Janie pointed out, even with all the measures that they were taking on their projects, there was still a lot to be done because they couldn't engage the occupants. And the occupants control a lot of the energy use. It's not the design team, it's not necessarily the developer or the owner who's making the decisions about the energy use in buildings, it's the occupants. So net zero is an aspirational goal for many projects. It is enabling us to learn an awful lot about how to design better buildings. It's also pointing out all that we don't know about how to engage occupants in using less energy and being more efficient in their choices about how to use energy. And I think as we go forward, it's informing the entire building industry and improving, it has potential to improve all buildings. But for the time being, it is still the sort of thing that is not going to be achievable for every single building at the present time. There are some buildings that are too large or have too intensive energy use to achieve it within their footprint or their site.
Jane, I'm going to turn to you to comment, but I would also like to add one thing, which is you have overseen about 1,150 units, it says here. How do you engage occupants?
Well, we have a resident services coordinator that when we go into a property and we do an energy retrofit, we have a workshop and describe to them what we're doing. At 7th Street, where we had the fire and new occupants moved in, actually, unfortunately, the fire was caused by a cigarette, a careless smoker. So we decided in 2009 that was going to be our first smoke-free building, not realizing, the stir it's causing now. But everyone who signed, and it was part of the lease that if they moved in, they were aware that this building was an energy efficient building, that our goal was to reduce its energy and help them save energy, and also reduce the indoor air quality issues by having it smoke-free. So people that moved in were very happy and very pleased, and we bought kind of some gadgets for folks to, we bought the strips of, the power strips that they could save energy, and we showed them how to use them. We had switches that were designed that you could shut off when you you could plug in your microwave, but for the clock, you could just shut that off. And so there's a lot of little details that we did, but that still didn't stop. And then we created a recycling program. We have this program called Properly Handed, where people are recycling and we see them recycling. We'll give them a gift card and post it in our newsletter to CVS or someplace. So we try to engage residents. And then the final step, though, would be to see if we can track their usage after we do the education. And people are very reluctant to sign those waivers so that we can track their utilities, because then we get a glimpse of their, and we've been trying to work with NSTAR to change this, but we get the glimpse of their utility bill, and people don't want to share that, what they're paying, or, so we had a problem. And so all this energy tracking that we're doing in our portfolio does not include the usage of the residents, and that's where the energy is getting used. And at 7th Street, I was so disappointed when we got the first first 3 months of usage to see that, we didn't get there. And, I said to the consultants and the engineers and the architects, we did everything right, we did the blower door test, and we insulated the crap out of this place, and we put in, as much PV. We had a church, we had a tree, we had so many constraints on the roof, but we maximized as much as we could, and we still didn't get there. And then they came back and said to me, well, it's your plug loads, but also it's your climate zone. This is not zone 4, this is zone 5, and the winter conditions are problematic. So renewables are effective, in the summer where we're not producing any electricity, but in the wintertime, we have clouds and we don't have as much solar, but we also have a significant climate condition that we have to address. So, I haven't given up on it. We're still working towards it, but these are some of the continued problems that we're facing.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from the panel is that there is tremendous opportunity out there to push the envelope, both in terms of the technologies, in terms of the practices, in terms of learning, and in terms of engaging people to make the city move closer to the aspirational goal. So my question, I'm going to start again with Janet, is that if you're in the city government here in Cambridge, what do you do to keep this momentum going? Do you adopt a net energy zero goal? Or do you retain some flexibility, but what actions can you take that will advance energy efficiency improvements, will advance renewables?
In this case, I actually think that Cambridge is doing it exactly right. Start with the education of our children. I think that one of the things that we are really trying to push at MLK is to Martin Luther King, which is the school that we're designing for the city of Cambridge, is that we're going to engage both the faculty as well as the students and teach them about their building, and then have them actually be the people who control the energy use within the building. We are gathering an enormous amount of data with the way that we're designing the metering and everything in the building, and if that data then is pushed back to the teachers and pushed back to the students and even pushed back to the community, it will be able to be used then, and they will learn from how we're using the building. And they will be able to even tell, oh, Mrs. Smith's classroom, uses way more energy than Mr. Jones's classroom. What's up with that? And it might be that Mrs. Smith's classroom just happens to be on the north side and doesn't benefit from the daylight. But that in and of itself is a teaching opportunity about how does the orientation, how does the windows, and how does everything, like the natural as well as artificial lighting in your building affect your energy consumption. One of the terms that Rob over here, is our consultant on the project, has pounded into our head is it's living within an energy budget. We need to say, this is how much energy we're going to use and for the building. And you make a good estimate based on benchmarking and all this sort of thing. But how do we do that? And how do we, we have to track it over 12 months of the year, and then we report back, did we make it or not? And if we didn't make it, well, then why not? Is it because the building was using more hours than we predicted, and we actually need to reassess our energy budget from the very beginning? Because if you use the building 12 hours and you only thought it was going to use it for 10, you're using more energy. Or is it that people didn't quite understand how to use those controls, and it wasn't quite tweaked the way that it should, and you're not getting as much efficiency out of your systems as you should be? And so it's that kind of the thinking that the students from the very beginning, it becomes a part of their everyday lives. They will take that home. They will understand that flipping the light this way means spending energy, and flipping the light that way means saving energy, and it becomes a part of their everyday lives, and that's the way that overall you will improve the energy efficiency of Cambridge, because ultimately it is the users and the choices that they make.
But if it's that, and energy remains relative to most developed countries very inexpensive. So if I have a real efficient building, my electric bill is not very high. my heating bill is not very high, so maybe I don't care whether I keep the lights on, or don't turn the computer off, or don't turn the thermostat down when I go to work, because I've got this super efficient building, it doesn't cost much to operate. So how do you overcome that?
The greatest loads that we actually end up dealing with end up being the plug loads anyway. I mean, as far as like really that energy reduction, you can only go so far with the efficiency, and the rest of it is all the users. Like if we're talking about how much energy the building's really going to use, and not the theoretical modeled output that a lot of people get caught up in, but the actual energy you actually use at the end of the day is totally about the users, whether it's the maintenance people or the actual people who are flipping on and off the lights, or the number of computers that get left on, or the number of gadgets that end up getting plugged in. That's where the big differences can be made. And I don't know, I've found mostly in this, at least in this culture, if you can use less energy and it's less money, then that's attractive. And all these people that are learning this and are going to have that as part of their daily regimen will be spending even less than the other people that just have the energy efficient building.
Stephen?
Well, I think there's culturally a significant attitude shift that has to come with the technology, the design, and the advances that technical people and applications people can make. And I think that currently in the US, we often view our buildings as essentially giant power strips. I mean, this is where all of our energy-related activity happens. This is where we charge our devices. This is where we turn on our lights. This is where we leave those vampire loads running. And now some of us, this is where we charge our cars, you know. And we don't think of buildings as so much as a power sink that we're trying to put on a budget, as we think of them as a power source. And one of the things that we try to achieve with very high performance buildings that we commission is what we call default off. Most buildings are not default off. There's a lot of stuff that runs. I think if you think about the kind of attitude shift that has to take place especially in the U.S., where we have a very high expectation of comfort and amenity in our buildings, there's a significant shift that has to take place in order to more aggressively pursue the default off state. And there may be some inconvenience or impact on personal choices. Another thing that's very interesting to us, we were talking a little bit a moment ago about behavioral issues. We do a lot of work in very large commercial and institutional buildings. We do a lot of work for colleges and universities and municipalities. And people behave very differently in a shared daytime space than they do in the home. So if I'm at home and it's stuffy at this time of year, I throw open my window. But in the workplace, people may be afraid of group dynamics or offending coworkers, or there's a different kind of behavior that has to emerge over time. And that's not something that happens overnight. So I enjoyed Janet's remarks about inculcating some attitudinal shifts. Back to the question of what's right for Cambridge, I know that I was in Stockholm last month with international experts from all over the world, and I heard some very interesting things. So China wants to reduce its energy intensity in buildings, so it's going to legislate. And if your building uses more energy than you're allocated, then you can't get any more, or you're going to have to pay a very steep price for it. I don't think that kind of approach will work in Cambridge, I'm not sure. And in a well-established and historic urban community, there are a lot of creative tensions around this issue. Just as we would love to super insulate every building and drive its energy needs very low, we do enjoy the historic facades of our buildings. We're not going to do spray-applied insulation on the exterior of Harvard Yard, I think, anytime soon. So we live with those tensions. It's very interesting, the struggles of siting offshore wind. people don't want to look at our energy sources. So imagine your urban fabric altered by buildings festooned with building-mounted solar, wind, solar thermal. The cityscape would be very different. So I don't know how each community is going to attack this issue, but I do see Cambridge really in a wonderful leadership position on this and well poised. And this is the perfect place for this debate to take place and the perfect community to take bold new steps. Maybe there are microgrids that can spring up in Cambridge. Maybe people can share electricity with each other, share energy across property lines. Maybe the community can aggregate some of its energy needs and look to more sustainable sources for it than just taking what NSTAR will deliver off of the grid. What I do know is that we're trapped within the confines of a cheap energy era where the externalities of our energy were not priced into our energy spend. And it's a bad place to be, and we've got to really break some barriers to find ways out of it. And I'm an applications guy. I'm a technologist. I can make buildings hum and sing and dance, but I'm not a government person, and I'm not a social behavioralist. But I have to be a little bit of all of those in my work. But it's this coming together, not only of the experts, not only of community leaders, but of the community around this issue to put pressure on all sides and find some new way to move forward. If that can't happen in Cambridge, where can it?
I'd like to make one plug here for Eric's operation, is that if you look around the United States and you ask the question, what state is the leader in this country in energy efficiency? I think most everyone, and I go around the country, would say Massachusetts. And there's a lot to do with, I think that the leadership that has been in this, in the energy resource area here in the state for the last 15 years. And I know when I go to states, they all want to copy what's going on in Massachusetts. Now, Eric, you're the Deputy Director of the Green Communities Division. If you had a wish that green communities would do so that you look 5 years from now and they said, this is what we accomplished, the two most important things that cities can have. I'm not going to ask you particular advice for Cambridge because you've already told me you're not going to give it. What would you like to see Massachusetts communities do that they're not doing now over the next 5 years?
Well, let me answer that, but let me just respond to something quickly that you said before that I think creates a problem for us when we talk about zero net energy buildings and how we look at construction and costs. So even though at a single building or a single project, energy cost in the scheme of things may not be that significant, I think it's really important to remember that in the aggregate, when you take all of Cambridge's buildings together, or all of your school buildings, or all of the state buildings, we're talking about fairly high costs, fairly significant impacts on our budgets. The other thing to remember is that when we build a building now, that building is with us for decades, if not centuries. We have buildings in the state portfolio that are well over 100 years old. So buildings we build now, the decisions we make now will be with us, well past the time that many or most of us will be around. So I think it's really important to remember that the long-term economic impacts of our decisions in retail are significant. Two things, that's a tough one, because there are so many things I think that we could be doing. But I think if I could I'll try and put this into two things. There might be like 1A and 1B and 2A and 2B, so bear with me here. I think, first of all, as we talk to folks around the country that are looking at zero net energy buildings, advanced building performance, almost everyone to a T is saying that where we need to start is within those entities that have a much longer time horizon, that understand that the decisions we make today don't have to pay back for themselves within 3 years or 5 years, the way most businesses or most commercial folks think. And so what a lot of people say really is that we need to start with public buildings and then move quickly into institutional buildings, so hospitals, college campuses around the country. And that's a fairly significant chunk of buildings. In fact, here in Massachusetts, the state, even through the downturn, was one of the few places where new construction was still happening. Bonds were still being issued. Large projects were, 200,000 square feet of new projects were being built in various places in the state. So I think if one thing I would say is for cities and towns in Massachusetts to focus on their own buildings and to really drive new construction to a much better, a much higher performance, as well as existing buildings. The second thing I think within that is to really focus on efficiency. Efficiency is the cheaper way to go. It is the more cost-effective strategy to get at greenhouse gas emission reductions, to save money, to just reduce our demand on the grid. We love renewables, we want to do renewables, and we should incorporate them wherever we can. But by focusing on efficiency and really benchmarking our buildings, as Jenna has said, and understanding what sort of energy budget and what sort of energy performance we want from our buildings, I think is a really important strategy to be able to drive energy use down in the design, but also to monitor and track afterwards. I think we don't do enough monitoring and tracking at all, whether it's us in the state or municipalities. We're all trying to do that better. We're trying to get better information about how our buildings are performing, but it's the first thing that kind of drops off people's radars. We get a great fancy new building with lots of glass and beautiful lobbies and marble and wood, and then we just sort of forget to watch the building over time. So that's all within sort of the construct, I think, of efficiency first, not just at the design side, but also in the post-occupancy side.
Okay, I'm going to open it up in a couple of minutes, so if you've got questions, I just want to alert you that I'm going to be looking for hands shortly. But I would like to ask Rob, what I've heard here tonight is a lot of very thoughtful responses. If you were all taking a class, I'd give you all A's, but I could see people saying, look, we've been talking about energy efficiency for many years, and we haven't done as much as we should. We've got a climate problem that looms in the future. We've got a real set of problems, and we're all basically moving slowly. So if I were Cambridge and I wanted to move to get a lot more renewables a lot faster, I wanted to get energy efficiency faster, what would be your response to me?
Well, I would say I would encourage Cambridge to do whatever Cambridge can do to move those two goals forward. I think that the biggest thing that the government entity of the city of Cambridge can do is lead by example. I think also that states have a tremendous amount of influence in terms of building codes and incentives and other things to help drive the market to adopt more efficiency. But having said that, it is a great struggle that we face. It's a cultural issue that Stephen talked about. It's based on the way we value things in this country, the fact that we don't necessarily pay for the true cost of our energy use today. Our children and grandchildren are probably paying a disproportionate share of what we're doing right now. And unfortunately, I think that the way things work in this country, things are going to have to get a lot worse before they get a lot better. Having said that, though, there are positive things. Without forcing people to drive more efficiently, our cars are much more efficient than they ever were before. Without forcing people to use less energy in buildings are gradually using less energy because of building code. So it's not moving as fast as many people would like, and myself included. Part of that is our own fault because it's easy for us to say, well, somebody needs to do something about it, but not take personal responsibility. So that's part of the issue, and part of the issue is wrapped up in the bigger cultural issue of this country and what this country seems to be all about. But I'm an optimist, and I think that what's going to happen is that things will get worse. But then I think that there's going to be a tremendous amount of experience from people who have been trying to push the envelope. There's going to be a movement to adopt changes in a much more rapid way. And then I believe that we will have substantial change at some point. If you had looked at the air and water in this country back in the 1950s, you probably wouldn't have thought that we would have the clean air and the relatively clean air and clean water that we have now. Things got really bad before they got better. So I'd like to be an optimist. I'd like to look to the future and say that, you know, we have to keep trying. We have to keep leading by example. We have to do everything we can. And but I'm also a realist, and I understand that we're not going to turn this whole country around and get everybody to adopt different behaviors overnight. And we're certainly not going to do it with cheap energy.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, all of that makes sense. But let's say I changed the form of government in Cambridge and had a dictatorship. And let's say I made a dictator. What would you do differently than is being done now?
Well, I think Stephen's story about China is a good one. You know? Basically, put a switch on the outside of every house, and you know, when you've used your quota, turn it off, and that's that. Or put a meter on every single plug and tell people they have to feed a quarter in if they want to charge something or watch TV or whatever. But you know, that's taking it to the extremes. I think that if it was a dictatorship, you know, I would suggest that the way forward would still be to be a benign or a benevolent dictatorship.
That's what I'm talking
and to try to bring people along in a reasonable and peaceful way, and convince them that it's in their best interest to alter their behavior, and give them information, give them real-time information about what they're doing and how it's impacting Cambridge. Educate them, provide you know, public information that's readily obvious to everyone in Cambridge about what's going on in any given minute of the day with energy use in Cambridge and with your carbon footprint. You know, it's like the debt clock that was in New York City that I used to see when I lived there. You know, it was ticking up the national debt. I think there are ways of approaching this without being, you know, heavy-handed about it. Because at the end of the day, you want people to make the choice to change. You don't want to force them into making change, because I don't think that's as lasting. I mean, we can't even, you know, when we decide we want to lose weight, we can't even succeed at that. So, you know, getting to net zero is a lot like that diet you start every year, and you know, do you make it at the end or not? And it's hard, and it takes a lot of effort. So it'd be very, very difficult to force people into this overnight in a dictatorship.
So, Jane, you were a dictator. What would you do? Differently, yes, yeah.
Well, I would like to see, I guess I would like to see every building track its energy use, and if they didn't, you know, achieve the energy use, then some disincentive, like maybe shutting off the electricity. But if they encourage their neighbors to save energy and reduce it, maybe some incentive. But I think, I always, when I try to promote energy, I always say that the renewables are sort of the icing on the cake, that you really have to think about, you know, making the cake and looking at building envelope. And there are so many buildings in Cambridge that, you know, there's new construction, yes, but the percentage of existing buildings that really are energy hogs. And that's what we did. We tried to address, let's look at our energy hogs through, you know, tracking their energy usage and identify those and try to improve those. So, and that's what we did. And now we're looking at, you know, improving our overall portfolio. But I think there has to be some program that is a way to identify all these energy hogs that, you know, some property owners don't care as much as this panel does, or some our youth folks there about, you know, saving energy. But if they have a high energy use and they're not, I'll give just a quick example. My nephew just moved to Cambridge, graduated college, so he got an apartment in Central Square, and so he's, you know, I often, I was helping him out, and he asked me to take a look at his apartment because he's paying this phenomenally high rent. I mean, I don't know how he can afford it with 3 other roommates. And I went in and I thought the windows weren't operable, the single pane windows, and I just saw like, oh my, the energy usage that this owner is not providing, they're not providing anything for these residents, and it just boggles the mind that there's probably so many other properties like this in Cambridge that we're not identifying and really coming up for them. And that really infuriates me. And our goal in our portfolio is remedy that. So I think in the additional cost of, we don't talk about net zero, the additional cost, but for an affordable housing, that's a premium. And where resources are really difficult to get in the city and even though the Cambridge is phenomenally generous, those resources are becoming less and less, and they're very scarce, and there isn't a premium. And the payback is extensive. For PV, it's a 20-year payback. For solar domestic, it's close to that. But we're still finding those resources because we believe that this is what we need to do. But I think, focusing on the building and somehow making people accountable for inefficient buildings is really what I would like to see in a dictatorship of mine.
So the message I get is that while net energy zero may be an aspirational goal, there is a lot of potential to do better than we're now doing.